for a wonderful paper, so rich and interesting, and just lays out a whole bunch of issues in such a clear way. So I've really enjoyed reading the paper, and even more hearing it. That was great. So I'll just start just very briefly summarizing some of the key points of the paper, and then I'll go on to raise a few questions about the argument. So Victor's provocative thesis is that in at least some central cases, duress may be morally justifying of pro tanto wrong actions, even killings. And so he doesn't claim to have shown this decisively, this conclusion, but does aim to offer significant support for it. So in that spirit of exploration, I'll raise some questions about whether the considerations that he adduces here really do provide significant support. Okay, so Victor presents to us a kind of powerful argument on the other side, and I'll call this the shield argument, and it goes something like this. So D, or who was it, Victor, acts impermissibly in human shield in that case. But that case you might think is morally similar or on a par to the standard duress case because of considerations like the doctrine of doing and allowing and the means principle, for example. So if these are morally on a par, then Victor acts impermissibly in the standard duress case. Okay, but Victor responds to this argument in a couple of different ways. So one is to argue that the same conclusion doesn't follow if you vary the case somewhat. So for example, in the doomed to die variation, the conclusion isn't right, that doesn't follow. Sorry, this is your computer, can I move this? Sorry. Okay. So remember, the doomed to die case is the case where Jeff is going to be killed anyway, but Helen threatens Victor that if he doesn't do it, she'll kill him too, so they'll both be killed. So Victor offers, I think, a really interesting argument that applies just to that kind of variation. A different kind of response, and this was in the second half of the paper, is to suggest that the conclusion in the human shield argument doesn't fall, it may be false, even when we're just thinking about the standard duress case, forget about the doomed to die kinds of cases. And the reason for that is that there are two key disanalogies between the human shield case and the standard duress case, and those are morally significant disanalogies. Okay, and I think he wants to say something even further. It's not just to kind of rebut the shield argument itself, but to go further and try to say, hey, once we focus on these disanalogies, we'll actually see that there is reason to think that the killing is justified in the standard duress cases. Okay, so before getting to questions about Victor's arguments, I just want to raise a couple of questions about his focus on justification as opposed to excuse. So first, Victor suggests that the questions are related in a pretty straightforward way, so that the focus of justification, which in the paper he suggests is an easier question, maybe that's true, will allow us to say something about excuse too. So just as a kind of reminder, we're thinking we have justification when the person doesn't act wrongly, maybe contrary to initial appearances, but we have excuse when we say the person acted wrongly but is either not blameworthy or less blameworthy than they otherwise would be. Okay, so Victor suggests that questions about justification come first because, as he puts it in the paper, evaluating when duress is justified is important when in evaluating when it excuses. And the reason is that the closer that Victor is to being justified for killing Jeff, the stronger the reason we will have to excuse Victor. So we're entitled to excuse, as he says, only if our reasoning has been interfered with in a way that has led us to act wrongly, but we're likely to be excused only if our reasoning did not dramatically depart from that which was required, and that will be so only if our conduct was reasonably close to being justified. Now, it seems like if you just think about excuse just in general, then at most one way of being excused would be to point out that they were close to being justified. I mean, that does seem like one kind of excuse. You say, oh, well, it was hard to tell, and they thought they were justified, and they were close, they just weren't quite justified. That seems like one way of being excused. But that's not the only way. I mean, we think, acting on a compulsion, say, or under delusion, those are ways of being excused too. And those might be cases in which our reasoning has actually departed pretty radically from what was required. So while getting clear on what would justify might tell us something about what would excuse, I don't think that's going to be the whole story, even in the case of duress. Okay, maybe more importantly for our purposes, though, maybe this is just reporting on my intuitions, but I find it difficult in at least some of the cases to be sure whether my intuitions about a particular case are intuitions about permissibility or blameworthiness. So for example, Victor, or at least the way he presents it, he has this kind of confident intuition about the insurance threat case. And I just, maybe because I've overthought this for too long and think too much about blameworthiness. But I'm not, so Victor's intuition is that he's permitted to blow up a shop to save himself and his family, knowing that a bystander will die. Maybe, but I mean, another intuition that'd be hard to distinguish would be, well, he's got a really good excuse, or he's got a partial excuse, or something like that. So I don't want to say that we can't come to conclusions about whether something's permissible versus whether it's blameworthy, but I'm not sure, at least for me, that I can so directly sort my intuitions about those two things. Okay. So for now, let's just leave the relationship of justification and excuse to the side and return to the shield argument. So that's it's just one argument against duress as a justification, and maybe there are some principles, maybe in addition to the doctrine of doing and allowing, or the means principle, that speak against the permissibility of killing even in the duress case. For example, it would violate the victim's right to life in the case of duress, and we have a duty not to do so. And then I realized I said, oh, let's set the distinction of excuse and justification aside. But I guess you could combine this with the idea that we'd still be willing to excuse in some cases, or at least partially, without agreeing that it's permitted. Okay, so there might be other arguments other than the shield argument or the kind of reasoning that's been discussed so far. Still, I think that's a really powerful argument, and Victor's treatment of it is really subtle and interesting. And he's concerned not only to evaluate that argument, but also in the process to uncover possible ways of showing not just the negative conclusion that the argument's flawed, but the positive conclusion that duress can itself be a justification. Okay, so let's get to Victor's responses to the argument. Okay, so first focus on the doomed to die case. Whether or not the conclusion's correct, I think I want to resist Victor's reasoning for it, at least the reasoning in the paper. He just gave me some new reasoning, so maybe that's good. But so in the paper, Victor suggests that the fact that the victim ought to Jeff in this case ought to select Victor as the killer, whether or not he actually does so, that provides a powerful reason in favor of permitting Victor to kill Jeff. So in that way, this is just quoting from the paper, D's killing of V, the victim, would not show disrespect to V as an independent reasoning agent. But I don't think the point about disrespect or getting us off the hook follows from this idea that the victim ought to select Victor as the killer. So, I mean, the fact that people ought or even are morally required to make certain decisions doesn't mean that we thereby fail to disrespect them whenever we enact what they ought to decide. So, I mean, take a case of someone with a terminal disease of some sort, and we think, well, it would be so low cost for her to enroll in this experimental program or this study, and it could potentially have really significant effects for all kinds of people. She really ought to do it. We might think she's actually morally required, but she doesn't do it. She decides not to. I don't think we'd be off the hook in the respect department by just enrolling her anyway against her wishes. So again, I think it's possible that Victor's ultimate conclusion in the case is right, but I don't think that a kind of hypothetical duty to consent plays a positive role in justifying that conclusion. Okay, or at least I actually wrote this, or at least I need to see more in the way of argument, and he already gave it to me, so there you go. Okay, so next turn to the 2 points of disanalogy between human shield and standard duress that Victor identifies. And before we get there, let's just shift a bit as Victor did, and I think this is fine, from the standard duress case where it's only your life that's threatened, but it's you and your family, say. So call that standard duress plus, or duress plus for short, because I agree, I think that brings out the intuitions more. And I think it's okay to do that because you could also do something parallel for human shield. So imagine there too, the shield is not just for you, but you and your family behind you, something like that. Okay, so let's see. Okay. Oh, page. Okay, so the first disanalogy rests on the idea that in duress plus family, one has made oneself the agent of another, or the tool, as Victor described it. Okay, so there's so much to discuss here. I'm just going to focus on two lines of reasoning. So first is the series of cases that Victor offers us, and I think these are all on the handout. So there's something intuitive about the idea that we're permitted to provide a sword in the sword case, similarly to allow ourselves to be a human club in human club, and so in a similar way to allow ourselves to be a tool in the sense of adopting the disposition to follow instructions, whatever the instructions may be. Okay, so here I think you might just question the first step. You might question the conclusion in the sword case. Are we really permitted to provide the sword if we know for certain that it's going to be used to kill? You might think, well, intuition-wise, we could work backwards, and we could think, well, you can't kill in the duress case, so you can't make yourself a human club, so you can't give the sword. But Victor doesn't just leave us with intuitions. That's not the way the argument goes. He provides a deeper explanation for why in the duress plus case one might be permitted to kill for similar reasons as the other cases. So we need to evaluate that. And as I understand it, it hinges on the idea that that D, in this case, the person who's threatened, that their responsibility is in a way reduced in virtue of the fact that what's really guiding them is this second order intention. So it's your intention to follow instructions, and not so much the first order intention, which turns out to be, kill this person. But what's really guiding you is this second order intention, and that reduces your responsibility in some way. So here I think we can ask a couple of questions. One is, why, just because the person in question, Victor, in our example, just because he views the second order intention as more important than the first in this case and as his guiding intention, that should reduce his responsibility for then fulfilling the first order one. So think about it this way, maybe another kind of case. We often think of larger intentions generating more specific ones. For example, Anne wants to win the election, so she authorizes unscrupulous advertisements or opposition research or whatever it is. It seems like it's no excuse at all for her to say, well, all I was being guided by was I wanted to do whatever it would take to win, and then it turned out, well, it would take that. But it was the second order intention, whatever it takes to win. That was what was guiding me. Okay, so it's not clear that that will actually reduce your responsibility. And then further, I'm not sure why reduced responsibility then becomes relevant to justification. If anything, maybe this does take us a little bit back to the question about excuse. It might be more relevant to excuse than justification. But even setting responsibility aside, and as I heard it in the talk today, that didn't play as big a role, I think. I think there's there's this idea that Victor has that this sort of noticing this distinction between second order and first order intentions could help us to see that that Victor isn't even using the victim as a means in the case, not in the sword case, and so maybe not in the other cases. And the reason seems to be that he's basically in kind of allowing himself to be used as a tool, then he is himself used as a means. And so, so that there's the idea there. But it seems to me that using and being used can happen at the same time. One doesn't rule out the other. So it could be true. In this case, I think you could think of it this way, that Victor is himself being used as a means, but he's also using the victim as a means in the duress case. Okay, so for all of these reasons, I'm not convinced that this particular disanalogy between human shield and duress is morally significant. Okay, so let's turn to the second point of disanalogy. The basic idea here, as I understand it, is that in human shield, the victim is not involved until D involves him for his own benefit, whereas in standard duress, the victim is already involved. And in fact, D wouldn't even be in the situation he's in had V not existed or not been present. Okay, so in human shield, when D kills V, the victim has two different complaints. Okay, so first, the victim would say, hey, you're using me as a means. And second, the victim can say, I didn't even have anything to do with this. I was just standing there. I was no contribution to the threat that you're now facing. Okay, but then in the duress case, only that first complaint is available. So fewer complaints, maybe less wrong. Okay, so, and further, Victor suggests that the victim can be expected to internalize the costs of his own existence, and that's what would happen if D kills him. Okay, so now again, Victor doesn't claim, oh, I've just shown that killing is permitted in the standard duress case. But he does suggest that this is a morally significant difference between the two cases, and one that might lead us or kind of support the conclusion that killing is permitted in the standard duress case. Okay, so I'm not sure myself that this is even a morally significant difference. And to see why, I mean, maybe you're already thinking like this, consider what it would mean if one has reason to, or is to be expected to, internalize the costs of one's own existence or presence in cases like this, things over which the victim, imagine it's you have no control over, having been picked out by the threatener to be in that situation. So it does seem to me that, you know, being in the wrong place at the right time can now license all kinds of ways of treating you. I realize it's not just being a bystander, but it still seems to share this idea of just being in the wrong place at the wrong time through no fault of your own. And there's something that just seems somewhat counterintuitive to me. Okay, but I'll try to give a little bit of an argument too. So consider a different kind of case in which X threatens your life unless you shoot someone in a crowd. So they just say, they haven't picked out anybody yet, they just want you to shoot someone in a crowd. There's no particular person who is in some sense the reason you're in the predicament that you're in. Does that now change standard duress into human shield, morally speaking, on Victor's view? There's the question. And it's not clear to me how that variant on standard duress is morally different from standard duress itself. So whether there's already a person picked out or not, just doesn't seem morally relevant to me about whether you're permitted to kill. But it would seem that on Victor's view, they are morally distinguishable in that the fact that X has already selected a particular victim makes killing in the standard duress case more apt for justification. And that just seems to me a counterintuitive result. Okay, so another reason not to see that feature as a morally significant one. Okay, in closing, it's worth noting that we might have, and probably do, have more visceral reactions to human shield than to standard duress, particularly if our means of killing in the standard duress case does it. Usually it's shooting, so you're kind of, you imagine you're far away, whereas the shield, you know, you're holding the person right up against you. And there may be even differences that are morally salient, but that just don't make a difference to the question of permissibility. And so far, though I'm open to more argument, I don't see reason to think there is a moral principle that plausibly distinguishes the cases when it comes to permissibility. So here I've tried to raise a few questions about the reasoning Victor sets out in favor of the thesis that desert can be justified in at least some central cases. But I hope to have also made clear that I believe Victor's made an elegant and original case for pursuing the idea of duress as justification. And I think he set out a really useful framework in which we can think about this. Thanks so much.